security guarantees have long been a sticking point, actually from the beginning of the war, when Russia and Ukraine started discussing early in 2022 potential off-ramps for the conflict. One of the issues that kept coming into play was Russia's demands that, for example, Ukraine cap the size of its military, it cap the size of its defense industry, and certainly that it limit its involvement or relationship with Western powers, especially NATO membership, but even well short of that. All of those concerns and sticking points are now coming back into the fray when it comes to European and U.S. discussions about what security guarantees they can offer to Ukraine to essentially backstop any peace deal reached with Russia. And now it seems that Moscow is pushing back on some of the claims that President Trump made that Russian President Vladimir Putin had agreed to some sort of Article 5-like commitment in his summit with Trump last Friday.
Jenny, Donald Trump has outlined an ambitious timetable for negotiations with Putin, forecasting at the beginning of this week, perhaps a sit down between Volodymyr Zelenskiy and Putin within a 2-week time frame. Now, with these doubts emerging, what is Donald Trump's next move? How much longer does he give Putin before he actually starts to lower the boom in some fashion?
In some ways, we've been having this conversation for months where President Trump lobs threats at President Putin in order to try and draw him to the negotiating table. He put down this ultimatum about a month ago, threatening secondary tariffs on Russia's trade partners and maybe even stricter sanctions. He has yet to execute on that, even though the date for that ultimatum for Putin to agree to a ceasefire has long since passed. The only country under which he's acted is India, and that's probably more about their own trade relationship with the U.S. than about Russia itself. So I think it remains to be seen whether President Trump will take any action against Putin, but certainly his actions to date suggest that that's not something he's really eager to do. I think the other thing is looking at the calendar of events. Putin's due to be traveling to China very soon for attending the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference and then a major military parade in Beijing. So even just from a perspective of the calendar, it doesn't look like he's going to be available for a meeting. And then you add on to it Moscow essentially walking back its willingness to engage in further conversations, saying that there are things that need to be worked out before the two presidents were to sit down. And I think all that suggests that 2 weeks might be overly ambitious.
Well, Jenny, I'm glad that you brought up India, because we actually heard from a senior counselor to President Trump when it comes to trade, Peter Navarro, today. Some of the headlines on the Bloomberg terminal reading, Navarro is saying that the road to peace runs through New Delhi, adding that he does see the doubling of India tariffs taking place on August 27th. Of course, as you well know, India is facing a 50% tariff threat over its imports of Russian energy supplies. How are we seeing these so-called secondary tariffs play into this conversation? Is this more about the trade with India? Is this more about holding Russia accountable? How are you watching this thread? As the president did say perhaps a week ago that maybe some other countries could be in the firing line here and see additional tariffs as well.
India is certainly a major importer of Russian crude, and their imports have ticked up after the Ukraine war started. They import about 39%. But China is, in many ways, the far more consequential player here, both from an economic and a strategic standpoint. It imports far more Russian crude, if that's what we're talking about. It's also a major supplier of other inputs into the Russian economy, many of which the United States has previously claimed go directly into Russian war machine components like drones. There's also the kind of larger strategic issue at play here, which is that Russia and China are closer strategic partners. They're collaborating in everywhere from the UN to places like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that are going to be meeting. And so in prior conversations, the road to peace may not run through New Delhi, but perhaps more through Beijing. Of course, China's been really reticent to take on that role. And I think the unspoken thing here is the Trump administration is wary of escalating its tensions with China after recognizing that Beijing has this major card to play in the form of critical mineral export controls. So I think there's a little bit of taking on India because it doesn't have the same sort of tools that China can deploy in terms of retaliation. And it helps advance, at least from the Trump administration's perspective, stalled trade talks and maybe try and get more concessions out of New Delhi.
Well, Jenny, China introduced itself in a way into the discussions through Russia and through the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, talking about China having a seat at the table in the discussions on security guarantees, somehow something that Volodymyr Zelenskiy has rejected. Was this even part of the talks last week in Anchorage or on Monday in Washington? And how are U.S. officials looking at this now?
It's really unclear whether or not they were part of discussions last Friday or on Monday, because we have yet to receive many details at all about what was discussed in either of those summits. But it was a topic of discussion back in 2022. And even then, Ukraine was very wary of the suggestion, largely because, one, it saw it as a way of Russia exercising either a direct or an indirect veto over its security. And two, because Beijing, as we've just been discussing, has been a long-standing and committed partner to Russia, even amidst this war, and maybe even funneling inputs into its war machine. Ukraine doesn't want a country like that to have a role in defining its future security. So whether or not U.S. officials have kind of caught on to that and are concerned about it, I think remains to be seen. But certainly this is of concern in Ukraine, and it'll be concern in Europe, too.